In this tutorial, I'm going to cover the complete guide on how to use Sweep Mesh. Sweep Mesh was introduced in Maya 2022, and it allows you to take a curve and apply Sweep Mesh to it to begin extruding some geometry along that curve. So you no longer need to use the longer way like I've described in the previous video on how to extrude geometry along the curve. With Sweep Mesh, this is done now very quickly, and then you just added some options that are provided with Sweep Mesh. Now, it doesn't mean that you're never going to use Extrude Along the curve, but Sweep Mesh just simply makes the entire process quicker, more procedural, and has a lot of options for you to adjust. And this is perfect for things like cables, wires, ropes, tubes, pipes, trims, and molding. So in this tutorial, we are going to cover how to use the Sweep Mesh. Now, before we get started, very quickly, I want to mention that if you want to learn Maya completely from scratch, so you can begin modeling your own environments, props, assets, and UV those assets without any prior 3D modeling or UV knowledge or ever touching Maya before, then I recommend you download the only course you will ever need as a complete beginner, Maya Foundation tutorial course. It will teach you everything you need to know about Maya, how to get started, how to model, and how to UV. You can download it by clicking on the link in the description box, or if you are on the worldofleveldesign.com watching this there, then there'll be a link there as well. Now let's continue with the tutorial. So first let me show you the complete basics of having a curve and applying Sweep Mesh to it and where to get to the options. And then we're going to break down how to create curves, how to modify them, and then how to go through all the options of Sweep Mesh. So I'm going to create a curve by going to Create, Curve Tools, and use any of these curves. And I like to use the EP curve. And I'm just going to draw a curve, press Enter to create it. Now to extrude along the curve, just simply have this curve selected and apply Sweep Mesh by going to Create, Sweep Mesh. As soon as you do, by default, you will already have geometry extruded along that curve. If I zoom in a little closer, it will be rounded, cylindrical extrusion along that curve. And inside the attribute editor is where you will see all the options for Sweep Mesh. If you're back at channel box, you just simply need to select the object that you applied Sweep Mesh to, go back to attribute editor, and make sure you are under Sweep Mesh Creator tab, and you'll find all the options for it. And that's how you use Sweep Mesh. Now let's jump back and start from scratch by covering a little bit more in detail for creating curves, modifying them, and then going through all the options for Sweep Mesh. So to use Sweep Mesh, you need to create curves. And you'll get access to curves under Create, Curve Tools, and you can peel out this menu, so we'll cover a few of these. You'll also find a tool shelf that's provided to you by Autodesk on install of Maya by switching over to Curves and Surfaces tab right here. And you'll have ability to create some curves really quickly without going through the menus. So we'll come back to this in just a second after we cover some of these. So as I mentioned in the Extrude Along the Curve tutorial, fundamentally there are no differences between any of these curves once they are created. They will provide the same type of curve. So as far as Maya extruding geometry along the curve, they're all the same curves in the end. The only difference is how you create these curves and how they are controlled. And that's where all these different curves stand out. It's just a matter of how they are created and how they are controlled. So to keep things simple, I like using EP Curve tool. This is the easiest one and the simplest one to create, and also the easiest and the simplest one to control. The CV curve is very similar to EP Curve, but it has a different way for you to edit the control points. So you can try one or the other. I prefer the EP Curve tool. So let's create this one. I'm going to left click to enable it. And for EP Curve, you need at least 3 points before the curve can be created. 3 or more. Anytime you create a curve, it will always be drawn on top of the grid. So I'm inside the perspective viewport. And if I start left clicking once to place the first point, left click again to place the second point, left click again to place the third point, now I have a curve. Now I can press enter. Pressing enter will create the curve. Or I can continue to left click to add additional points before I finalize the curve. So let's say I've placed 5 points here. I'm going to press enter. And now I have my curve. Now, as you can see, it's created on top of the grid. So let me re-enable EP curve. If I am in any orthographic viewports, let's say in the front view, and I begin to left click and create my curve here, press enter, it will be created on top of the grid in the front view. So it depends where you draw the curve, that's where it will be created on top of that grid. All the curves you create, when you select them, hit W, E or R for rotate or scale. I'm going to hit W for move tool. All the pivot points are going to be in the world origin for any curves you create. So it will often be helpful to modify the pivot point to be somewhere along that curve, usually at the very start of the curve where you draw on, or where you begin to draw the curve, where you place the first point. Or you can just center that pivot point. So if I wanted to modify this pivot point, I could center it by going to modify and center pivot. Or I can modify and drag this pivot point somewhere along that curve. And I like to place pivot points at the beginning where the first point was created. So it's going to be right here for that one. So to modify pivot points, it's the same hotkeys as when you modify pivot points on polygonal objects. If you hold down D, this will enter into pivot modification mode. So let me show it to you. So when you hold down D, you can see that gizmo changed. And then to snap this pivot point along the curve and just drag it to the beginning somewhere along that curve, also hold down C. So I'm holding down D and C, and then middle mouse click and drag on the curve and just drag it to the beginning. Release all the buttons, and now you have modified your pivot point to the start of the curve. And you can do that to any curve. Of course, you can also snap pivot points by holding down D and X and middle mouse click and drag. This will snap to a grid. Or hold down D and V. V will snap to a vertex or a point. So I can quickly snap to that beginning or somewhere else to another control point. So in this case, I'm just going to hold down D, C, and middle mouse click and drag. Just drag it along the curve to the beginning of the curve, like so. Now, once you've created a curve, you can modify the shape of this curve by having that curve selected and then right-click hold for a control context menu and go into the component mode for that curve. So to modify the control points along this curve and change the shape, change over to control vertex. And you'll have a set of vertices for you to select and drag and modify this curve. So once you've created the curve, you still can modify this curve to any shape that you want. And in this case, you can actually drag it and modify it so it's not flat on the grid. You can just drag it up and down and give it some dimension, some 3D dimension to it, so it's not on top of the grid. And then once you're done modifying it, right-click hold, go back to object mode, reselect the curve, and now you've modified the curve and you can do something with it. Let me just drag this curve just a little further away. Now, there are times you may need to create not rounded curves, like some of these more organic flowing curves, but you may need to create a linear curve, the one that can create 90-degree angles. To do this, go to EP curve options, and we've been working with curve degree 3 cubic. This is the default, and these are the curves that it creates. Nice organic flowing curves. But if you want linear curves or very straight line curves, change to 1 linear. And now if you begin to create a curve, and I'm going to snap to the grid this time, so that way I create straight lines. I'm going to hold down X, left click, so it snaps to a grid. And I'm just going to left click again, just continue placing points and snap into the grid. So you can see 1 linear degree curve creates straight lines. So if you ever need to create very linear curves, this is how you do it. Change EP curve settings to 1 linear. I'm going to hit enter, and now I have a very linear straight line curve. Let me go back to the options. I'm going to reset it to default 3 cubic. And now, in addition to using the EP curve, you can use the CV curve. It does very similar things. Just the control vertice, how you added these curves will be slightly different. But also, instead of having to place constant points if you're using EP curve and have to place points along, and actually you'll have to place points for every single one of these, for CB, EP, or Bezier curve, you'll have to place individual points and just reshape the curve. However, to quickly draw freehand a curve, you can use pencil curve tool. This is really very efficient and very quick. So I'm going to enable pencil curve tool, and I'm just simply going to left click, hold and drag, and create the curve very quickly. So I didn't have to place any points. I just freehand drew the curve and created it. Now, in addition to using this floating menu, the curve tool, you can switch over to curves and surfaces shelf and use the same options here, but on the shelf. So if you don't want to use the menu, in here you have ability to create this third icon right here. This is your EP curve, and then you have the pencil. So these were placed for you by Autodesk, kind of like a quick access shelf for curves and surfaces. So instead of going to drop down menus, they're available here. Not all of them, but some of them. And you can also create a NURB circle or a NURB square. NURB circle is very useful. It's a closed shape. And you come over here. I already created one, so I can scale it. And I created a perfectly rounded circle. It's a closed shape, but you could use this as a curve to sweep along. I'm going to go ahead, select it, and delete it. If you want to delete any of the curves, just select them, hit delete. They're gone. If you create a square, this actually will be 4 individual curves instead of one continuous curve. So just be aware that actually creates 4 curves. So I'm going to select them all, delete it. All right, so now that you know how to create curves and different types of curves and how to modify them by controlling the vertices of those curves, let's cover how to use sweep mesh. I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to use the existing curves that were created. To use sweep mesh, just simply select one curve or multiple curves. Go to create and apply sweep mesh. As soon as you do, you will have the option pop up. Now, again, like I said, you can do this to one curve or you can do this to multiple curves. If you happen to do this to multiple curves, they will all be adjusted at the same time. So you're not going to be able to actually edit them and change the options of sweep mesh individually. They'll all be together as a group. However, you will still be able to modify the curve in order to change the shape. It's just what the sweep mesh is doing. It'll all be applied to all of them as if it's one single curve. So let's go. I'm just going to select a single curve. And let's go ahead and apply sweep mesh to it again. Create sweep mesh. And let's go ahead and zoom in a little closer so we can see. So the first thing that you are going to see and want to change is the sweep profiles. And again, if you ever lose this menu and you deselect it, when you select the sweep mesh, the extruded shape, the geometry, you need to switch over to attribute editor and then switch over to the sweep mesh creator tab to get the menu back. By default, you will have a poly sweep profile. And right below this, you will have certain options for each of these profiles. So the default is poly and we have 8 sides. You can change the number of sides as well as the type. But first, before we go through all these options, because they're all going to be different depending on which profile you choose, let's just click over to another profile. So we can change over to rectangle. Now our shape extruded is a rectangular shape. We can do line, which is a single poly line extruded along the curve. We can do an arc, which is a half a shape. We can do a wave, or we can do custom. We'll cover custom a little later. So the first 5, you just simply changed the shape that you want to be extruded along the curve. And for each of these extrusions, for each of these profiles, you will have options to control further. So for the first one, if you want to change the number of sides, you can, to make it more rounded. You can change it to a star. You can enable cap, which will cap off the open edge border on each side at the beginning and also at the end. And some of these profiles will have a lot more options to control. For example, the rectangular option will have width for you to define as well as the height. If you want to push these further than the slider, you can always type in a value. And then the further slider will be available for you to tweak. You'll have corner radius. So basically with all of these options, you just play around with them and see what they do. Instead of just me going over every single one, you just drag the slider and interactively you'll see it update inside the viewport. Line doesn't have that many options. Arc and wave has a few more than the other ones. So you have to just decide which of the sweep profiles you want to extrude along your curve and just tweak the settings for it. Let's go back to poly. Then once you've confirmed the sweep profile you want to use, let me cover the distribution. I'm going to open this up and I'm going to enable distribute. What distribute allows you to do is take an existing sweep mesh in the profile you chose, and then it takes it and duplicates it around your curve. And then you can change the distribution to radial, which is a circular distribution. You can change it to a square, and you can change it to linear. And for each of these, then you can adjust the number of instances, how many of these you want to duplicate and distribute along the curve. You can scale the instances, making them smaller or larger. You can rotate them. And you can adjust the coverage, meaning that do you want to sweep across 360 degrees or less. Maybe you want it to sweep and distribute only along 180, which is 0.5. Very useful, and this is a great way to create a more complex network of your extrusion along your curve. So this is perfect for twisted cables, maybe some rebars or ropes. And then next we can adjust the transformation. So while we have this distribution still enabled, so that way we can really see what's going to be happening to our transformation. Under transformation, you can adjust the scale of your profile, making it smaller and making it larger. So you can scale your extrusion. You can rotate it. Or the other two useful options are you can twist it. Basically, you're going to be twisting the entire extrusion and the profile and kind of twisting it into that rope or rebar shape. And if I want to go beyond the limit of 2, let me type in the value, let's say 5. And you can see that it's beginning to take the extruded shapes and twist them into a more complex shapes that it would be very difficult to do otherwise with the old method of using extrude along the curve. And taper will simply take and make the end thinner or thicker. So I'm actually going to type in taper. Let's change it up to, let's say 10. And when I get to the other end, the thickness of the taper increased on the end, or I can taper it down and make it smaller on the end. So it's going to take the beginning of the curve, it's going to keep that the same, and then eventually it's going to taper off and either pinch it or enlarge it depending on the value of taper. So these are very useful options to create very complex shape, as you can see here. And then we can even go further into the taper of the curve and adjust along which part of the curve that is going to be thicker or thinner. So if I open up the taper curve, I'm going to set this back down to 1, so it's all the same again. And then I'm going to open up the taper curve, and here I can define the beginning and the end and how much it's going to taper on or off, and which parts are going to be thicker or thinner along the curve, not just at the end. So if I left click to place a point, you can see that the curve right here, right at that point right there in the beginning, is beginning to get thinner or thicker. Now it's going to be at a specific size, so we cannot go any larger. So if I wanted to get it larger, so maybe let me increase that scale profile to 5. So here I can go ahead and actually show you much better. So I can begin to squeeze some parts and pinch them and enlarge some parts along the entire extrusion and define a custom profile. Like so. Very handy for specific type of objects. And if you want to just reset everything back to a straight curve without having your own custom profile, just left click on these X's and just delete all these points that you placed and get back to normal. Let's reset it back to, let's make it larger by going down to just 2, not 1. A little further down, interpolation will create the sweep mesh extruded geometry, either lower poly or higher poly. So I'm going to stick with the mode of precision, and then I can adjust the precision. And if I increase it, you can see that it's adding more divisions to the extrusion. And if I lower it, it's making it less, making it a little lower poly. So it's simply removing the amount of edges and making it less precise. Another very handy tool to optimize the entire extrusion along the curve is to enable optimize. This will go through the entire curve and remove some unnecessary edges, especially along the straight lines. So here's what it was before, and here's what it is after. It's not very good, so we can maybe increase the precision and add a little bit more. Actually, let me reset it back to not have the distribute, and I don't want any twisting going on here. So go back to the regular straight. So now we just have a single extruded geometry along the curve, and let me close the taper curve. So here's what it was before optimize, with precision a little lower, so it's lower poly. Let's reset it back to 75, and by clicking optimize, it will simply remove unnecessary edges and optimize the entire curve extrusion. Very handy when you don't want all that amount of divisions extruded along the curve. And another very, very useful thing about using sweep mesh is your UVs are already done. They have been unfolded for you, no matter what the curve and extrusion is. So under UVs, we don't need to change anything. It already has create UVs set to unfold. So all I need to do is just open up the UV editor and just show you. So here are UVs for the extruded curve and the geometry along that curve. So the UVs are already done. And remember, as long as you keep history on this curve, you can still modify the shape of the curve by selecting the curve, not the polygonal object, but the curve itself. And then right-click hold in the empty space and switch over to Control Vertex. And then select the vertices and move them around. And the extruded shape will modify. And then if you need to adjust what sweep mesh is doing, go back to object mode for the curve, select the extruded geometry, and go back to attribute editor into the sweep mesh creator 1 tab and adjust the properties here again. So as long as you have history and you haven't deleted history in this object, you will have access to continuously modify and update the curve. So if I go ahead and I have a icon on my custom tool shelf, if I delete history, everything will be gone and any dependencies on the curve. So if I select the curve and try to modify it again, they're no longer attached. And I no longer have ability to go back into sweep mesh and modify it. So keep history on an object for as long as you need. So that way you can continue modifying the shape, the extrusion, as well as the sweep mesh, the geometry that's extruded along the curve. Now let's cover how to use a custom mesh with sweep mesh to extrude along the curve. So I'm going to select this curve that I have and I'm going to apply sweep mesh to it. And in the properties, under sweep profile, select custom. A menu will pop up and asking you, what type of object do you want to use as a custom profile, as a custom mesh to extrude along the curve? So you can use a curve object, you can use a poly object, you can use a face or an edge. We're just going to cover poly object. Now we need a poly object to extrude along our curve. So we don't have one yet. So let me go ahead and cancel this and let's create something. So to make this work, your poly object has to have open border edges. So you can't just create a cube and then try to extrude that cube. You need to delete some faces along it. So one of the best ways is to actually create a plane instead of a cube. And I'm going to actually make the amount of geometry here a lot less. So let's go to channel box. Really quickly, I'm going to change the subdivision width and height to 5. Just make it a little simpler. And it doesn't matter where this object is at. We'll just be able to select it. So now let me go ahead and select the sweep mesh, the extruded curve. Go back to attribute editor, change to the tab, sweep mesh creator 1, change to custom. And now I'm going to change the type from curve object to poly object. And then profile, it's telling me to select it. So now I'm going to select it. You can see that it took this mesh, this polygonal object, and now it's using it as a profile to extrude along the curve. Once you're happy with this, you need to click OK. So now it's going to use, once you click OK, it's now using this object as the profile to extrude along the curve. Now, a very useful thing is if you begin to, let's say, scale this, it's going to update. If you begin to delete any edges or faces, it's also going to update on the extruded mesh. So it's completely dynamic. So I'm going to actually switch over to faces and I'm going to delete a couple here in the corners to change the profile. And you can see that it's changing the profile of the extrusion. Now, if I adjust any vertices, let's say I scale them, it's also going to begin to adjust the profile. Everything is interactive and dynamic. So if I take these two, push them up, here's my new profile. Now the shape is going to be completely up to you. It all depends on the shape of your geometry. You can even select the edges and begin to extrude them. So here I extruded the bottom face and you can see that it's updating the extrusion as well. So it's extremely flexible and extremely powerful. And here are a new shape, new profile. Let me go ahead and actually select the entire object, make it a little smaller. And you still have ability to go back into this and you have distribution, you have transformation, you have the twist and the taper, you have the interpolation. So you still have all these adjustments that you can make inside the sweep mesh options in addition to changing the profile that is being extruded along your curve. So for this option, you'll have to play around with it to kind of get used to how it works and see what the limitations and what the options are on the amount of objects and everything you can do to your profile shape. But like I mentioned, when you use the polygonal object, it needs to have open border edges. You can also just jump back to the other options anytime and just leave the custom. So if you don't like what you created, just go back to one of the sweep profiles given to you. Just to show you, so let's say I create a cube. Here's my cube. If I try to use this as my custom shape, go back to Sweep Mesh Creator tab, Custom. I'm gonna choose Select New Shape, and it's gonna give me an error that right here on the bottom it says has no border edges. So your object, that the custom shape, needs to have open border edges. So I'm gonna just delete and have an open border edge, and now it worked. But you also have ability to choose a curve. So as an example, let's go ahead and I'm gonna delete this shape. Let's cancel it. Let me reselect it, go back to Sweep Mesh Creator. Let me create a quick curve. I'm gonna use this circle. So let me drag it over here. I'm gonna make it larger. So let's say I wanna use a curve instead of a polygonal object. So I'm gonna go back to the options, select Custom. I'm gonna choose Curve Object instead of Poly Object. And now I'm gonna use Select and choose my new curve. And that's using the curve profile to extrude along that curve that we created. And here's our geometry. Now, of course, I can just select the curve again. I can scale it. I can switch over to Control Vertices and modify the shape of this. And update my profile. So you can have polygonal objects as well as curves that you extrude. So as you can see how powerful this can be. Now let me show you a trick to modifying the curve very quickly instead of using Control Vertices to have to adjust one control vertex at a time to modify the curve and the extruded shape along with it. So here I have a curve that I used pencil tool on to create the curve, to draw it freehand. And if I switch over to Control Vertices, you can see there's a lot of control vertices here. So it would take a long time for me to modify this one by one. I can simplify the curve, it will make it easier, but I'm going to show you a quick trick to organically modify the entire curve very quickly, almost effortlessly. So I'm going to go back to object mode, select the curve, and I'm going to apply sweep mesh to it. I have sweep mesh in my custom tool shelf right here, so I don't have to go in the drop down menu every time. So I'm just going to apply sweep mesh, and here's the extrusion. So now I'm going to select the curve, and the way I'm selecting the curve without having to select the object is if you select just the extrusion, the geometry itself, and you can invert your selection to select the curve, because the curve is often hard to select because it's hidden inside the geometry. So by selecting the geometry first, then holding down Shift, left click and drag, this will invert the selection, deselect the geometry and select the curve. And of course you can also use the outliner to select the curve. Now with the curve selected, if you go to curves, you can lock length, and this will lock the curve. And then when you switch over to a control point, so with the curve still selected, I'm going to switch over to control vertex, not control point, but control vertex. And either select the beginning of a curve or the end of the curve, that control vertex at either end, and then left click, hold and drag and modify the curve. It simply will begin to treat that curve as one single object. It will lock the length where it will not make it larger or smaller. It will keep the length of the curve, and it will just simply modify the curve and drag the entire curve along with it by either dragging the front or the back control points or control vertices. You can also do this in the center as well, but I have too many within the curve itself, so the best way is to select the beginning or the end. And also this works extremely well if you go to top view. So that way it will be adjusted just on a flat plane. So let's say you have rope or cable laying flat on the ground and you just want to organically modify it. So let me just zoom out, and I'm just going to grab the beginning or the end and just drag it. Let's say I just want to reposition this, maybe curve this one around like so. Very quick way, great way to modify organically any of your curves by locking the length. And then when you are done and you want to unlock it, go back to the curve itself, go back to curves and unlock length. And now if you switch over, now it will be treated as default, where you can actually modify the beginning and the end, and the entire curve will not be dragged along with its length locked. So extremely useful way to modify your curves by locking the length, dragging the beginning or the end point, and then unlocking it so you continue working on it like you are used to. In this technique, I want to show you how to create additional curves from polygonal edges. So instead of using create and using the curve tools to create your curves to extrude and use sweep mesh along, you can actually select a set of edges on a polygonal object and then convert those edges to a curve, and then you can use sweep mesh on. So I'm going to use two different objects. So for the first one, you can either double click to select the entire edge ring, or you can just select a set of edges. So let's say I only want half. So from here, let's say all the way to here. Let's say I want to have this edge, but I want to have it as a curve so I can use sweep mesh on. So with the edges selected, you just simply go to modify, convert, and I'm going to peel off this menu and just simply use and convert polygon edges to curve. As soon as you do, that edge will be converted to a curve. Now with that curve selected, you can go ahead and use sweep mesh on. And with all the options that you have available here, you'll have an extrusion made on that curve. So you can, of course, you can make that curve a lot more complex depending on the edges you select, and then use sweep mesh on. This is great for extra detail with an object, as well as, let's say you want some trim or some kind of a trim borders or something a little more intricate on the edges of the mesh. So for this example, on the cylinder, this is just a cylindrical object that I scaled along Y to make it a little bit more long. And let's say I want to create some kind of a trim. And I want to take those edges, these edges all around, and I want to convert them to a curve. So using the convert, I have those edges selected, and I'm going to convert those edges from polygon edges to curve. Now in this case, sometimes you may want to have those edges be very geometric and very straight. And by converting a polygon edge to a curve, it will be rounded. It will have a more rounded appearance, like we used an EP curve with cubic degree. As I showed you before, when you create a curve, EP curve, you can switch over to linear, which is straight. And by default, when you convert edges, it will be 3 cubic, meaning that everything's going to be rounded. However, let me go ahead and select this curve. I'm going to delete it. You can actually select the edges and keep them completely straight like you see here. So depending on what kind of curve, what kind of edge you want to convert to a curve. Do you want it to have it more rounded, like we did on a cylindrical or on a spherical object? Or do you want it to be more aligned with the shape, like you see here, very low poly and very angular, more linear? So to do that, let me reselect the edges. And I'm going to go to polygon edges to curve options. And I'm going to switch over from 3 cubic, which is the default, to linear, and hit apply. So now I have an edge that's a closed edge, completely linear. And with that, I can go ahead and have that curve selected, and I can run sweep mesh along. And with that, I can go ahead and use all of my regular options to create a very more intricate trim using any of the sweep mesh options. Super useful trick for more detail by taking an existing edge and converting it to a curve that you can use sweep mesh on. So sweep mesh is an extremely useful tool that you should begin to start using to create more organic and more intricate, more detailed extrusions along a curve. That would be very difficult to do otherwise if you were using a previous version where you did not have sweep mesh and you had to manually extrude along a curve. But now with sweep mesh, this makes the entire process extremely quick and very simple to create very complex shapes. If you are serious about modeling environment art, props, assets, modular buildings, or even characters, and you need to learn Maya from scratch without any previous 3D knowledge of modeling or UVing, then I recommend that you download Maya Foundation, the Homesteader course. It's the only course you need to begin learning Maya, both modeling and UVing completely from scratch. There's the link in the description box, or if you are on the website, on worldofleveldesign.com, watching it there, there'll be a link on the same page for you to download it.